Beneath the cold dust and diesel haze, something darker had settled over the valley, something that would soon turn one man's silence into the town's last roar. The wind carried soot through the narrow spine of Briar Gap, a coal town carved into the ribs of the Appalachian Mountains. Rusted signs swung on chains above shuttered storefronts. Pickup trucks rattled over cracked roads. The scent of ash, machine oil, and distant pine mingled in the cold March air. No one noticed the black SUV when it crested the ridge, idled for a beat, then rolled down into the valley like a slow, creeping infection. They never announced themselves, not at first. In the town's east quarter, down past the old dragline pit, a man split firewood with the kind of precision only muscle memory can grant. His name was Jack Callan. Early 40s, barrel-chested, thick beard dusted with gray. He wore silence like a coat. His hands were scarred, calloused. His left shoulder clicked faintly every time he raised the axe. Jack had once been a combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment. 3 tours. Decorations nobody ever asked about. One bad mission that ended it all. For the past 7 years, he'd been the quiet backbone of Briar Gap, fixing busted engines, hauling winter wood for widows, patching roofs after storms. The kind of man people leaned on without realizing they were leaning. A 2-tone pickup pulled up to the tree line. "Jack," came a voice, gravel thick with West Virginia drawl. It was Randy Bull Mercer, head foreman at Hollow Rock Mining Company and Jack's oldest friend. "We got a situation." Jack wiped his hands on a rag. "What kind?" Bull stepped out, jaw tight, eyes low. "Corporate sent new suits. Not from Hollow Rock. Outsiders. Saying they're from the parent company, Damon Resources. But they ain't talking expansion or safety reviews. Just the skin questions. Marking land. One of them tried to enter the Old South shaft. Alone. That shaft sealed." Jack's tone sharpened like a blade. "Exactly," Bull said. "They came armed. Not OSHA types, Jack. These guys, they're not here for coal." Jack studied the tree line, listening. The wind had shifted. He could feel it in his bones. Same feeling he had outside Kandahar before that convoy went up in flames. He nodded. "Let's talk to the crew." The miners met inside McCready's garage, a converted machine shop, and unofficial town hall. Jack, Bull, and Mira Quinn, the town's medic and Jack's closest ally since the army, stood in front of a circle of weathered faces. Riggers, drillers, mechanics, and loadmen. All tough, all loyal, none naive. "They've been taking soil samples," Mira said, unfolding a map on the workbench. "Near the creek. High-tech sensors, drones. I cross-checked their tags. Damon Resources is a shell. No filings. No public presence. They sent a guy to my place yesterday," said Ray Parker, one of the older miners. "Wanted to buy me out. Cash. Said there were environmental hazards under my land. Then hinted it might be condemned if I didn't sell." Bull growled. "They're trying to scare us off." Jack stared at the map. His voice was calm. "No, they're looking for something." Mira met his eyes. "You think it's under the mine?" Jack gave a single nod. "I think it's been here a long time. And someone just gave him the green light to take it, no matter who gets hurt." That night, Jack drove up the old switchback road toward Ridge 12, where the south shaft once opened into Hollow Rock's deepest seams. The gate was padlocked, rusted, but freshly disturbed. Boot prints in the mud. Not miner boots, tactical. He stepped through, flashlight cutting the dark. Inside, the mine was half collapsed, the air wet and stale. He moved quiet, every breath shallow. A rat scurried past. Then, click. Jack froze. Infrared lasers swept his chest. "You're trespassing," came a low voice from the shadows. "Turn around." Jack didn't move. "You're not Damon. You're not miners." No reply. Just another voice, female, cold. "Who are you?" Jack said nothing. Then in a flash, he dropped, rolled, and flanked the beam's origin. He came up behind the speaker, yanked the weapon free, disarmed her partner, and pinned them both to the wall with terrifying efficiency. The woman gasped as he pulled off her mask. "You don't want to do this," she hissed. Jack leaned close, his voice low. "Neither do you. But I will." Her partner spat blood. "You're already dead." You just don't know it yet. Jack cuffed their hands with zip ties from his belt, gagged them, and disappeared into the darkness. By morning, the SUV was gone. The suits didn't return that day, but a drone buzzed low over the town, and a state police vehicle was spotted parked near the entrance to Briar Gap. The town was being watched. Inside McCready's, Jack poured coffee over an old topographic map. Mira leaned over his shoulder, whispering, "You think they've been looking for this for years?" Jack nodded. There was a weapons test site not far from here. Black Book, buried deep after the Cold War. I read something once, biosynthetic metals. Prototype tech. Toxic if mishandled. Someone's digging in the wrong place. And if they find it, she asked, they won't stop. Not until this whole mountain is a crater. Outside, a group of miners gathered. Bull stepped forward. What's the plan, Jack? Jack looked at the town. The faces. The kids playing stickball near the firehouse. The banners from last summer's fair still clinging to the porch railings. We do what we've always done, he said, voice hard. We watch each other's backs. We hold the line. Bull grinned. Then let's get dirty. Dense dawn-colored clouds hung over Briar Gap, pressing low on the ridges, blocking out the early light. The wind howled through rusty fences, rattling old bells on porches. Dogs barked. The birds were silent. The storm was more than just weather. Jack Callan stood on the rooftop of McCready's garage, binoculars trained on the ridge. A black SUV crept along the southern perimeter. Same type, same dark glass windows. Behind it, a box truck, unmarked. Industrial grade. Too clean for coal country. Down on Main Street, Mira Quinn was already at work. She patched up an old man's arm where a drone's tail fin had sliced the skin during a low pass. Medical incident, they called it in the official report. She didn't buy it. None of them did. In the shop below, Bull laid out maps, radio schematics, and an old metal case labeled M67 gear, retired. Jack eyed it. You sure about this? Jack asked. Bull grunted. You didn't ask if. Just how sure? Jack gave a half smile. Old habits. He cracked the case open. Inside were hand-tuned radios, tripwire sensors, and a scatter of defused ordnance from training exercises past. Jack's fingers moved over the contents like they were sacred. Tools of a former life, repurposed for something righteous. The first act of resistance came at 2:37 a.m. The Damon box truck had parked on the outskirts near Pine Hollow Creek. Its team fanned out with scanning equipment. They moved with military precision, not corporate caution. One set a spike into the ground, adjusting a humming transmitter. From the tree lean, Jack watched with Ray Parker, crouched low, breath still. The men below wore all black fatigues. No patches, no IDs. Jack whispered, "This isn't corporate." Ray muttered, "Looks like Delta boys." "Black Ops." "No," Jack said. "Private. Ex-military, maybe, but no chain of command." "Contractors." "PMC." Ray asked. Jack nodded slowly. "Worse. Ghosts." They slipped away just as the charges Bull had placed earlier triggered, a dull thump, followed by a cascading sizzle. The transmission tower sparked, popped, and crumpled like wet cardboard. By the time the first Damon operative reached it, the locals were long gone. The next morning, two federal-looking men arrived in town. Not in suits. In Department of Energy windbreakers, bright blue, standing out like sore thumbs among the denim and grease of Briar Gap. One of them, tall and pale, had the flat eyes of a man used to being obeyed. The other just looked tired. Both carried sidearms poorly concealed. They met with the town sheriff, a paunchy, good-hearted man named Walt Grissom, inside the diner. Jack sat 2 booths down, back to the wall, coffee in hand. "We're conducting a geological survey," said the tall man. "There's reason to believe this town is sitting on a contamination site. Decades old." Walt raised an eyebrow. "No one's been sick. Yet," the man replied. Jack leaned slightly. He caught the man's badge clipped just under his jacket. DOE Sective. Security Division. Not geology. The tired man said, "We're here for everyone's safety. We recommend a voluntary evacuation while we assess risk." "Bullshit," Jack muttered into his cup. Back in the garage, Jack paced in front of the town crew. They're using environmental hazard as a pretext. They want everyone gone so they can dig without interference. Mira was tracing radiation zones on an old military overlay. If they trigger anything down there, we're looking at long-term fallout. Not just toxic waste, experimental tech. The kind that bends more than metal. Ray snorted. And they think they can control it? They don't care, Jack said. They'll strip this place to the bone and disappear before it kills anyone important. Silence. Then Cassie Boone, a young welder with a streak of fire in her eyes, spoke up. So what do we do? Jack looked around. We make it hell for them to stay. We don't fight like soldiers. We fight like a town. They split into teams, sabotage. Bull's crew rigged back roads with tire spikes, blocked off key access points with mining debris, and rewired old coal conveyors to collapse if tampered with. Intel, Mira and 2 teens from the high school ham radio club tapped into the Damon drone frequencies, rerouting feeds and gathering footage. Community safety, Cassie and Ray led town-wide drills, blackout protocols, shelter construction, signal flares. The church basement became a field hospital overnight. Eyes and ears. Jack set up sentry points on the ridge, armed with thermal scopes and handmade suppressors. The people of Briar Gap, so long beaten down by economics and forgotten promises, found purpose in resistance. The town became a living organism, breathing together, reacting fast, always watching. But the enemy adapted. Damon agents increased patrols. They began searching homes under the guise of safety checks. One night, they raided Pete Garner's place, a widowed mechanic who walked with a cane. They tore apart his shed, destroyed his tools. Found nothing. 2 nights later, the black SUVs surrounded McCready's. Jack was waiting. Lights out. Generators dead. Every window dark. But not empty. As 2 agents approached the main door, it exploded outward in a cloud of smoke and ash. Not lethal, loud. Disorienting. Enough to send them staggering. From the shadows, Jack struck like a ghost. He took down the lead man with a fast elbow to the throat, disarmed the second, and shoved them both back toward their vehicles with a shotgun barrel at their spines. This is your warning, Jack growled. Behind him, the lights of the garage blinked on one by one. Every miner, mechanic, farmer, and welder standing behind Jack. Armed. Ready. Watching. From the tree line across the way, someone else was watching, too. A satellite phone clicked on. A voice, calm and cruel, spoke into the receiver. Resistance confirmed. Proceeding with Phase 2. The first real rain hit at midnight, hissing down like static. But it wasn't enough to wash away what was coming. Not from the dirt, not from their hearts. Briar Gap was never meant to be the front line. The town sat quiet under the rain, but tension cut through every drop like piano wire. Shutters were nailed down, floodlights covered, CB radios buzzed faintly behind every kitchen wall. Every porch had a loaded weapon near the door, and children were sent to stay in the old church cellar. Just in case. Jack Callan stood beneath the corrugated tin awning of McCready's garage, soaked to the elbows, boots in red clay. He'd barely slept. None of them had. But it wasn't exhaustion that pressed behind his eyes. It was knowing this wasn't just about land anymore. Inside, Mira slid a battered hard drive onto the workbench. The casing was dented and caked in dried mud. Drone footage, she said. We intercepted one of theirs. Brought it down with a copper wire trap just past the Ridge 12 fence line. Cassie wiped off the lens. Think it's encrypted? Mira shook her head. Already cracked it. You need to see this. She pulled up the video on the portable rig Jack had salvaged from the school science lab. The footage jittered, then stabilized. Thermal imaging, time-stamped 3 nights prior. Damon operatives clustered around a buried structure. Metallic, circular, fused into the rock. Symbols carved into its hull. Not coal. Not iron. Jack leaned in. That's not mining infrastructure. Mira said, no. It's military. Possibly Cold War. But I've never seen alloy scans like this. Maybe because it wasn't supposed to exist. The rain made it easier to move. Under the cover of storm, Jack led a recon team. Him, Bull, Cassie, and Mira, through the tree line toward the old drift mine, sealed decades ago after a gas collapse. But Damon had dug it open. They slipped in, boots silent on stone. The tunnel had changed. New lighting rigs, ventilation fans, surveillance cams turned inward, not outward. Jack's stomach turned. This wasn't just a dig site. It was a containment zone. Past the first bend, they found it. The chamber was massive, carved out by both man and machine. And at its center, a buried core, black and humming, coils and conduits latched into its sides like parasites. Liquid shimmered inside. Not water. Something thicker. Alive. Cassie whispered, "What the hell is that?" Jack replied without looking away. "Something they found, but don't understand." Mira tapped the side panel. "These readings, Jack, if they breach this containment, we're talking ecological collapse. This could poison the entire valley." He turned toward her, voice flat. "Then we stop them here." But the enemy had eyes, too. Back in town, Damon agents hit the Quinn Clinic. No knock. Just boots and batons. Looking for files. For Mira. They didn't find her, but they found her assistant, Andy, barely 19, who refused to give up the safe code. They broke 2 of his ribs. When Jack returned and saw the bruises, he went quiet. Too quiet. He helped Andy into a cot, set the ribs with Myra's guidance, and then walked outside into the rain. Everyone followed. He looked out over his people, drenched, tired, afraid, but still standing. They made this war. We didn't ask for it. A pause. But we'll finish it. Phase 2 had begun. Damon's forces tripled. They set up a perimeter wall on Ridge 12. Spotlights. Guards. Surveillance towers disguised as logging cranes. More black trucks. Even an armored carrier, unmarked, was flown in under the storm's cover. Jack knew what that meant. "They're preparing for lockdown," he told Bull. "They're going to push us out by force, or bury this place if they can't." Mira stepped forward. "Then we get proof. Real proof. Broadcast it. Show the world what they're hiding under our feet." They devised the plan over cracked maps and cheap coffee. Step 1. Infiltrate Damon's uplink site, a relay trailer near the old reservoir. Inside, high bandwidth comms, and possibly a full satellite connection. Step 2. Download internal files, blueprints, and footage from the underground chamber. Step 3. Transmit to every news agency, watchdog, and free signal that'll listen. Cassie raised a brow. "What about Step 4? Jack smiled without humor. "That's the one where we fight our way out." The night before the op, Jack stood on the ridge. Rain had eased. Clouds broke just enough for moonlight to touch the town's rooftops. Tin, wood, and rust, shining like armor. Mira joined him. "You never said what happened to you," she said softly. Jack didn't look away. "There was a mission. In Syria. Extraction gone wrong. We were supposed to pull a virologist out of Aleppo. Intel missed a double cross. Half the team died. The rest changed." Mira said nothing. "I stayed behind to give them time. Got left behind. 2 weeks in a basement. No backup. Only thing that kept me going was the thought of this place." Mira touched his arm. "You're not that man anymore." Jack finally turned. "That's the problem. I am. But now I have a reason to be." The mountain had gone quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that always came before the first shot. Or the last. The op began at 0300. Fog clung to the treetops, veiling the descent toward the old reservoir where Damon had set up their uplink site. A prefab command trailer sat nestled behind a ring of camouflage netting and 2 armed watchtowers. Fiber cables snaked from the structure into the ridge, linked to satellite dishes mounted atop retrofitted mining cranes. This wasn't survey work. It was containment logistics, the kind designed to erase an entire town if necessary. Jack Callan crouched in the tree line with Cassie, Mira, and Bull. "This uplinks their brain," Jack said quietly. "We take it, we bleed them. We show the world what they've buried." Cassie checked her gear. Homemade EMP charges, cobbled together from scrap wiring and microwave capacitors. Mira adjusted her sat pack, connected to a mobile rig she'd rebuilt from 3 generations of scavenged laptops. "We'll have 2 minutes to extract and transmit once we breach. No more. Bull chambered a round in his hunting rifle. Plenty. Jack nodded once. Go loud only if we have to. They can't know we were here until it's too late. Phase 1. Distraction at the North Ridge. 2 flare charges ignited near the tree line, bright enough to simulate movement. Damon's outer guards peeled off toward the light, flashlights sweeping, guns raised. Phase 2. Infiltration. Jack and Cassie moved low and fast, cutting through the rain-slick brush. They bypassed the first fence using a water diversion trench. Inside the compound perimeter, 2 guards remained at the trailer door. Cassie whispered, "Take the left." Jack just nodded. 2 seconds later, they moved, silent, brutal. Jack dropped his man with a rear choke and 1 sharp elbow. Cassie tossed hers with a hand-rigged shock prod, then dragged the body into the bushes. They were in. Inside the trailer, the truth waited. The air buzzed with power. Racks of servers hummed along the walls. Hardline links streamed encrypted data to a main terminal flashing sective. Eyes only. Mira rushed to the terminal. Fingers flew. Password locks military grade. But the OS is old. I can crack it. Jack scanned the interior, finding maps pinned behind a false panel. Red zones. Grid marks over Briar Gap. Heat signatures. A timer. He froze. Mira, she looked up, then saw it. A countdown. Operation Firewall initiated T. 72 hours. Cassie cursed under her breath. They're planning to burn the whole town. Myra's voice was ice. Not just that. They're dropping a tactical payload to bury the containment site and every witness around it. Bull growled. A cover-up. Jack clenched his fists. No. A massacre. Mira broke the firewall. Data spilled across the screen. Site schematics, surveillance footage, blueprints for an underground lab built in 1972 by the Darwin Initiative, a black-budget weapons program supposedly dissolved before the Gulf War. The chamber beneath Ridge 12 housed a biometal fusion core, part experimental weapon, part energy source. Abandoned after instability tests, but still active. And Damon Resources, it turned out, was just a front for a consortium of private military contractors and corrupt defense officials. They weren't here to protect anything. They were here to claim it and destroy everything else. Download starting, Mira said. Satellite link active. Transmitting to 15 media nodes. International watchdogs. University archives. Even Reddit. Cassie smirked. You're a menace. Thank you. Suddenly, a sharp ping on Myra's signal panel. Motion sensors. Backdoor. We've been made. Jack's voice dropped. Time to burn it. Cassie lobbed the EMP charge onto the main server core. Mira yanked the hard drive. Jack grabbed the files and maps. Then they ran, seconds before the trailer went dark, lights dead, signal scrambled. Behind them, alarms blared. Damon guards scrambled to contain the breach. Too late. They raced through the trees, breath ragged, branches slicing skin, boots slick with mud. Mira clutched the drive to her chest like it was gold. Behind them, the forest came alive with shouting, floodlights, and the whine of ATVs. Jack stopped at a split in the path. You 3 cut east. I'll lead them away. No way, Bull growled. Cassie, breathless. That's suicide. Jack pulled his knife, eyes fierce. It's what I do. He turned and vanished into the dark. Diversion worked. Jack ran them in circles, lit false trails with torch fuses, then doubled back. He took down one pursuer with a snare wire, another with a flashbang tucked under a root. They never caught him. By the time he slipped back into town, bloodied and soaked, the others were already back, drive intact, data transmitted, and the truth in the wind. The next morning, all hell broke loose. National outlets picked up the leaked files. Independent watchdogs began dissecting the footage. Hashtags started trending. Hashtag Briar Gap, hashtag Damon Cover Up, hashtag Dark Valley, but Damon didn't back down. Instead, they escalated. A convoy rolled into the valley. More personnel, heavier armor, and a mobile command post with jamming towers to cut outside comms. The enemy was cornered and ready to scorch the earth. That night, Jack stood with Bull, Mira, and the town's elders in the firehouse. Everything we've done. They'll come harder now, Bull said. We poke the bear, now we bleed. Jack stared into the flames of the old wood stove. Then we stopped waiting. We hit them before they hit us. Mira asked, You're talking war? Jack nodded slowly. We build the barricades. We use their own routes against them. We don't just resist now. We retake the mountain. Outside, the storm finally broke. Lightning split the sky. Rain poured down. Tush rolled off the ridge like smoke from a coming fire. And the people of Briar Gap began to prepare, not just to survive, but to fight. They came at dawn with machines and men, thinking they'd break a town built on fire and steel. But Briar Gap wasn't just waiting. It was ready. The rain stopped just long enough to see the enemy coming. From the overlook atop Widow's Crest, Jack watched the convoy emerge like a tide of iron. 4 armored personnel carriers, 2 mobile jamming rigs, and nearly 24 black-clad operatives moving with practiced precision. They weren't hiding anymore. Damon had gone full military. They're sealing the outer perimeter, Mira said beside him, peering through the spotting scope. Cutting off the roads, clearing forest. Isolation protocol. Jack exhaled through his nose. Final stage. Behind them, Briar Gap was transforming. Every tractor was repurposed into a barricade hauler. Coal carts laid rails for quick-moving supplies. Welding torches sparked in every shop. Old CB radios got rewired into a town-wide warning system. High schoolers reinforced sandbag lines while war vets prepped fallback points. This wasn't a militia. This was a community digging in. Inside the firehouse, now the command hub, Jack laid out the town's battle map. The jammers go first. Without their uplink, they're blind. Then we trap their ground units in the old quarry pass. He pointed to 2 ridges. Cassie's team will mine the western slope, deck cord, buried iron, EMP traps. Bull and I will lead a strike team to the second uplink trailer. We take that out, Mira can re-establish signal. Ray Parker raised a brow. And after that, Jack's voice didn't waver. Then we make them bleed. No one argued. That night, under red-filtered lanterns, families made peace. Letters were written. Rings passed from fathers to sons. Worn hands gripped younger shoulders. There were no speeches. Just silence. The kind forged between those who've worked side by side through winters, layoffs, funerals. The kind that binds souls before the storm. At first light, the battle began. Cassie and her crew triggered the first charge, an EMP blast that shorted Damon's west jammer and sent its generator tumbling down the slope. Sparks flew. The valley lit up with sudden chaos. Jack and Bull moved through the trees with 3 others, skirting the edge of the ridge. They reached the second jammer rig as Damon operatives scrambled to assess the hit. One of the guards turned just in time to see Jack's fist. It was the last thing he saw. Bull placed thermite charges on the transmitter core. Ready. Light it, Jack said. The blast sent a signal spike across the valley, enough for Mira to patch through. In the school basement, Myra's screen lit up like Christmas. Connection restored, emergency broadcast active. She didn't hesitate. She streamed everything. The burial site, the weapon, the cover-up files, the live footage of Damon's forces swarming a civilian town. To every major outlet, mirror site, and watchdog she could find. But Damon had eyes too. At 0930 hours, they struck back. A drone strike leveled the old mill where Cassie's team had staged their gear. 2 injured. 1, Jonas Quinn, Myra's cousin, was killed instantly. The news hit like a hammer. Mira dropped to her knees, silent, breath stolen. Jack found her in the alley behind the clinic, shaking, blood on her coat. I should have kept him back, she whispered. He wasn't trained. Jack knelt beside her. He believed in you. That matters. She looked at him, red-rimmed eyes blazing. Then let's make it mean something. That afternoon, Briar Gap went on the offensive. Farmers flanked Damon's western guard posts using irrigation trenches. Mechanics dropped barriers over the south access road with crane lifts. Teenagers flew drones made of scrap metal and GoPros, jamming enemy cameras with homemade static. Jack's strike team ambushed a Damon patrol at Coyote Hollow, dragging their gear into the mine tunnels and repurposing weapons for defense. One by one, Damon's outer positions fell. The town was no longer a target. It was a battleground. But then came the twist of the knife. A low-frequency tremor shook the ridge. Mira checked her seismic readout. They've activated the fusion core. Jack turned slowly. They're going to blow it. Bury us, and the evidence, with it. She nodded grimly. Unless we shut it down from the inside. That night, Jack gathered his core team. Mira, Bull, Cassie, me. We're going back into that chamber. Bull blinked. That place is sealed tighter than a vault now. Not to us, Jack said. We've still got the mine shafts. And the blueprints. Cassie looked at the schematic. How do we shut it down? We don't, Mira said. We sever its regulators. Force a containment lockdown. It'll freeze the core. We'll have minutes, maybe seconds, to get out. Ray Parker asked the question no one else wanted to. What if you don't? Jack just looked at him. Then we buy you time. The next assault would be the last. As Jack loaded his gear, Mira stepped beside him. We may not come back from this. Jack didn't look at her. That was true a long time ago. She touched his arm. You could have run. Left all this behind. He finally turned. I did once. Never again. Their eyes held. Grief, strength, something deeper. Then Jack slung his rifle over his shoulder, checked the trigger on his charges, and walked into the dark. Some wars are fought in open fields. Others in silence, under 1,000 tons of rock, where ghosts wait and steel remembers blood. The mine breathed like a long, wet stone, dripping echoes. The grind of old support beams bowing under pressure. Jack Callan led the team down the forgotten shaft beneath hollow rock, the tunnel that Damon's survey drones hadn't mapped, the one only locals remembered. Cassie had rigged a line of red LED markers, each dim as a cigarette ember. They moved fast but quiet. Jack, Mira, Cassie, Bull. For souls in the dark, carrying the hopes of an entire town on their backs. Behind them, the town itself was bracing for the end. Above ground, 1,700 hours. Damon launched their final push. 2 armored transports rolled through South Creek Road, flanked by infantry in full tactical gear. They came with gas rounds, stun grenades, sound cannons. Civilians were herded at gunpoint toward evacuation zones. But the people of Briar Gap weren't running anymore. Ray Parker stood at the northern line, shotgun braced against his shoulder. This is our dirt, he growled. You want it? Pay in blood. Behind him, 50 townsfolk in makeshift armor, lined across hay bales and bulldozers, each armed, each ready. And across the valley, the bells of St. Eliza's church rang, 5 times, loud and slow. The signal. The last stand had begun. Underground, 1,712 hours. The shaft opened into the main containment cavern, exactly where the schematic said it would. Myra's flashlight swept the walls. Coils of black metal glistened like bone under flesh. A humming pulse echoed from the center, low and alive. The fusion core, spherical, obsidian, cradled by steel tendrils and glowing with faint, blue fire. Above it, mounted to the wall, a control node surrounded by heat regulators and oxygen sealants. Cassie whispered, "This looks like a goddamn heart." Mira studied the panel. They've activated an auto-destruct sequence. If we don't intervene in 15 minutes, Bull finished it. There won't be a mountain left. Jack nodded. Mira, start the shutdown. Cassie, guard the flank. Bull, you're with me. We secure the escape route. Mira cracked her knuckles. I'm going in blind. Jack looked at her. You've never missed. She smiled tightly. Then let's keep the streak alive. Above ground, 1,720 hours. Gunfire cracked through the hills. Damon's forces breached the barricades with gas and rubber rounds, pushing into the town square. But they hadn't counted on how Briar Gap fought together. Firefighters rerouted the old hydrant lines, flooding alleys and stalling APCs in 6 feet of water. Farmers lit oil drums to cloak their flanks in smoke. Hunters used tree stands for sniper nests. Kids rolled marbles, soaked in kerosene under enemy boots. For every inch Damon gained, they paid with broken gear and wounded men. And still, the bells rang. Underground, 1,727 hours. Mira worked fast, fingers dancing over the terminal, sweat beading on her brow. "I need 2 more minutes," she whispered. Suddenly, a noise, metal on stone. Cassie spun, rifle raised. A Damon operative dropped from the ventilation shaft, silent, masked, blade drawn. She didn't hesitate. Bang! The shot echoed forever. The man dropped, dead. Another came from the shadows. Then 2 more. "Contact!" Cassie yelled. Jack and Bull raced back, gunfire flashing in the dark. Bull took one to the vest. Crack! Impact staggering him. Jack dropped the shooter with 2 quick bursts. Still breathing, Bull growled, wincing. Mira didn't flinch. "I'm almost there, just cover me." Above ground, 1,730 hours. A Damon gunship circled overhead. They broadcast a message through loudspeakers. "This is a federal operation. Cease resistance or face lethal force. Final warning." Ray Parker raised his radio, patched directly to Myra's emergency uplink. "You hear that, Doc?" he said. Myra's voice crackled through. "They're lying. Upload complete. The world's already watching." Then silence. Ray grinned. "Thought so." He turned to his line. "Light 'em up." Molotovs flew. A power substation exploded behind Damon's flank, fried by rewired lines. The townsfolk surged. Pitchforks, axes, wrenches. Rage given form. Briar Gap struck back. Underground. 1,733 hours. "Done," Mira shouted. The fusion core dimmed, pulsing slower, weaker. She slammed the final command. "Core lockdown initiated. Manual override required. TO abort. Let's move." Jack barked. They ran, Cassie grabbing Mira, Bull limping hard. Behind them, the core hissed and vented, steel creaking as containment sealed around it like a tomb. They reached the shaft and found it collapsing. Debris thundered down. The tunnel split. Fire licked the ceiling. Cassie screamed, "This way, fallback tunnel." She led them to a narrow passage behind an old gear room. Jack followed last, lungs burning, the weight of everything pressing down, until light. Real light. They burst through the emergency shaft, out into the storm-drenched edge of the ridge, breath heaving. Behind them, the core sealed with a roar, silent, final, buried. 1,739 hours. Damon forces halted. All comms cut. No uplink. No air support. Live streams of their failure blazing across every screen on Earth. A call came in from their command. "Stand down. Extraction order confirmed. You're burned." And just like that, they began pulling out. 1,745 hours. As Jack limped into the town square, Mira beside him, the people of Briar Gap turned to see. They didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They just stood, together, covered in soot, blood, rain, and defiance. Unbroken. Jack looked at them all, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in something again. Victory didn't feel like celebration. It felt like breath returning to broken lungs, raw, painful, but proof that you were still alive. 3 days passed before the smoke cleared. The valley had gone quiet. No gunships. No black trucks. The last of Damon's forces evacuated under cover of federal oversight, the real kind, dragged out by exposure, lawsuits, and a media firestorm too big to bury. But Briar Gap? It still stood. The square was half rubble. Bullet holes pockmarked storefronts. The old mill was a blackened husk, and the firehouse had become a triage center. Every able body worked without pause, hauling timber, clearing debris, tending wounds. A town that bled together had begun the work of healing together. In the shadow of it all, Jack Callan moved like a ghost. He helped where he could, lifting, hammering, carrying, but always quiet, always distant. The war inside him hadn't ended with Damon's retreat. Mira found him in the cemetery. He was kneeling beside a simple wooden cross. Jonas Quinn, her cousin, the one who died in the mill strike. Rain misted through the pine trees, soft and cold. "You didn't have to come out here," she said. Jack didn't answer at first, just brushed mud from the base of the cross. "He was just a kid," he finally said. "He was a fighter," Mira replied. "He died standing for something." Jack's voice dropped. I made the call that got him killed. No, she said, kneeling beside him. Damon made that call the moment they decided this town was expendable. She placed a hand over his. We all knew the risks. We all chose to stay. He looked at her, eyes dark, haunted. I've buried men before, but it never gets easier. It's not supposed to, she said softly. That's how you know you're still human. The town held a gathering that night. No speeches, just lanterns strung through the trees, warm fires, old songs on crackling radios. Families sat on overturned crates and broken steps, passing jugs of cider and mason jars of moonshine. The scars were visible, but so was the resilience. Kids played tag around sandbag piles. Old men told stories beneath tarps. And the sound of hammers, rebuilding, never fully stopped. At the center, Mira stepped up onto a pallet stage with a rusted mic. 3 days ago, the world thought we were a blip on the map, a dot they could erase. But now they know better. Cheers rose. We didn't have drones, or armor, or money, but we had each other. She raised her glass. To the ones we lost, to the ground we kept, to the fire that didn't burn us, but made us stronger. And the crowd echoed, stronger. Later, Jack stood alone near the edge of town, watching the ridge, listening to the wind. He knew Damon wasn't done. Men like that never vanished completely. They'd regroup, rebrand, hide behind new shell companies. But now, the world was watching. Now, Briar Gap had a voice. Behind him, Mira approached. You don't have to go, she said. He didn't turn. I'm not. She smiled. Good. Because we've still got a town to fix. He finally turned to her, the corner of his mouth lifting in something like a smile. I was never much good at fixing. She raised a brow. You fixed us. In the weeks that followed, the world took notice. Investigations launched. Whistleblowers stepped forward. Damon Resources collapsed in a web of criminal indictments, exposed networks, and congressional hearings. Footage from Myra's stream ran on every major news outlet. Activist groups rallied. Class action lawsuits followed. But Briar Gap didn't wait for justice to trickle down. They kept building, road by road, brick by brick. Together, the church bell rang again, not for war, but for weddings, birthdays, and harvest dinners. Jack didn't disappear this time. He helped teach mechanics at the trade school, ran drills for the volunteer fire unit, patched up fences, engines, and sometimes people. He'd never stopped being a soldier, but he'd found something better than a mission. A home. Final scene, late autumn, leaves falling over the ridge. A new sign stands at the entrance to town. Briar Gap Population, standing strong, founded, 1882. Rebuilt, 2025. Below it, someone had carved a new motto in hand-chiseled steel. We keep us safe. Jack stood by the sign, arms crossed, watching kids ride bikes where a convoy once rolled. Mira stepped beside him. They'll tell stories about this, she said. Good, Jack replied. Let him know how dangerous a small town can be when it stands up. She smiled. And behind them, the sun broke through the clouds. History doesn't remember paperwork. It remembers blood and fire and the people who refused to kneel. 6 months later, spring broke over Briar Gap like a second chance. Wildflowers bloomed where mortar holes had scorched the earth. Children played in the same fields Damon operatives once patrolled. The mine stayed sealed. The town didn't forget, but it chose to grow. Jack Callan stood before a crowd of high school seniors gathered beneath a rebuilt flagpole, flanked by locals, journalists, and state representatives. And that's why we don't wait for someone to come save us, he said into the mic. We become the people we needed. That's what you did. What you keep doing. The kids applauded, some out of respect, some because it was graduation and they wanted to move. But all of them knew what he meant. Jack nodded once and stepped back. He didn't do speeches, but he'd learned how to say just enough. The fallout from Damon's exposure had rippled far and wide. More than 24 arrests. 2 senators implicated in defense contract laundering. The Darwin Initiative was formally acknowledged as a Cold War rogue cell, disavowed by the Pentagon after 30 years of silence. A special counsel began reviewing classified experiments, site by site, country by country. Whistleblower protections passed through Congress with unusual speed. And Briar Gap? It became a symbol. Mira Quinn appeared on 3 major networks, then turned them all down. She gave one statement to the press: "We're not martyrs. We're not heroes. We're what happens when people remember how to stand beside each other." That's it. That's the truth. Then she went back to running the clinic. Quietly. With purpose. Cassie Boone started a nonprofit, Ridge Watch. It trained rural communities in emergency response, cyber defense, and resilience planning. Old-timers called her the Storm Scout. She laughed every time, but she never stopped working. Bull Mercer bought the old quarry and turned it into a training ground. Half the veterans in the region rotated through for free drills and survival education. His motto was simple: "We bleed once to stop them from making us bleed again." And Jack? He stayed. One night, Mira asked him why. "You could have gone anywhere. Disappeared. Started over." He shook his head, watching dusk settle over the rebuilt schoolhouse. "I did that once. Spent a decade trying to forget who I was. But I think maybe I was never broken. Maybe I was just waiting for a fight worth the cost." She rested her hand on his. "You found it." "Yeah," he said. "And I found you." Across the country, stories like theirs began to surface. Communities defending water rights. Towns standing against forced development. Veterans turning their training into shields, not swords. The system didn't fix itself, but it started listening. Because Briar Gap had forced it to. Final montage. Cinematic: a row of children planting trees where Damon's Tower once stood. The church bell tolling as survivors embrace, laughter mixing with tears. An overhead drone shot pulling back to show the valley, green and golden. Jack and Mira walking the ridge at sunset, silent, together. A caption fades in over the frame. "They tried to bury us. They didn't know we were roots." Some wounds don't bleed. They echo. In the silence, in the stillness, in the spaces where nothing's broken but everything still hurts. The summer heat came early that year. The mountains shimmered under the high sun, and cicadas thrummed through the pines like a warning pulse. On the surface, Briar Gap was thriving. New roofs, fresh paint, laughter echoing off rebuilt walls. But beneath that, something else simmered. A feeling Jack knew all too well. Restless peace. Jack Callan sat on the porch of the town's only barber shop, a cold bottle sweating in his hand. He watched as 2 kids tore down the street on bikes, sticks clattering against spokes to mimic motorcycles. He half-smiled, but his eyes never really relaxed. Mira joined him. "You ever let your shoulders drop?" Jack took a sip. "Only in my sleep. Sometimes." She sat beside him, stretched her legs. "You're waiting for the other shoe to drop." "I always am," he said quietly. Later that night, Jack found a letter taped to the firehouse door. No stamp. No return address. He opened it slowly, eyes scanning the printed words. "You think this is over, but you only killed one head. The rest of the snake is still moving." Darwin wasn't a program. It was a doctrine, a way of thinking, and some of us remember. "See you soon, Ranger." Jack's jaw locked. He folded the letter once, slid it into his pocket, and walked out into the street. The next day, an unfamiliar truck rolled into town. Not government. Not Damon. Just black steel, sun-baked and silent. A man stepped out, mid-50s, tight-cropped silver hair, walking like he still carried a sidearm on his hip. Jack was waiting. "Name's Travis Boone," the man said, offering nothing but the name and a handshake. "Cassie's uncle." Cassie stepped forward, confused. "You were off the grid." "I was off their grid," he corrected. "Didn't want them finding me. But then I saw what you all did, and I figured maybe it was time to come home." Jack looked him over. "You were Darwin?" The man didn't flinch. "I was one of the first to leave." They sat in the garage, blueprints spread out, the old war board dusted off. Travis spoke low, eyes distant. "Darwin didn't die in the 80s. It just got quiet. Fragmented. Went private. Private labs, rogue security groups. Sleeper ops. Not many of us left, but the ones that are, they're the truest believers." Bull muttered, "What do they want?" "Evolution," Travis said. "Not just tech. Control. You scare people enough, you don't need a weapon. Just a name." He pointed to a mark on the map, Bell Canyon. 2 counties over. They've been gathering. Small. Hidden. But it's them. Might not be Damon. But it's the same rot. Mira leaned forward. So what? We go to war again. Jack was quiet. Travis met his eyes. You started something, Callan. The world saw what you did. So did the rest of them. You shook the nest. Jack nodded slowly. Then maybe it's time to finish what we started. That night, Jack walked the ridge trail alone. He stood at the overlook, staring down at the lights of Briar Gap, flickering, warm, alive. He thought of Syria, of the basement, of the brothers he lost. And he thought of Jonas, of the way this place made him feel human again. But the past wasn't done with him. It never really is. In the darkness, his phone buzzed. A single photo. Satellite image. Bell Canyon. Heat signature. Movement. The caption, they're building again. Jack closed his eyes, breathed in, and turned back toward town. Some battles don't come to you. You have to walk into the dark and take them head on. Not for vengeance. For the ones behind you. 5 weeks later, the mission came together in whispers and handshakes. No formal meetings. No fanfare. Just intent. Quiet. Unshakable. Forged in fire. They called it Final Echo. Jack didn't ask anyone to come. They volunteered. Cassie, sharp-eyed and steady, carrying blueprints of the Bell Canyon facility etched into her memory. Mira, with a portable data rig and a needle kit strapped to her chest, just in case. Bull, recovered, patched up, but still fierce as hell. If you think I'm staying behind, you forgot who I am. Travis Boone, Darwin defector turned guide into the Devil's Heart. His voice quiet, guilt in every word. We won't get another shot at this, Jack said as they geared up under the cover of night. Mira met his eyes. That's why we're going. Bell Canyon was carved into the side of a cliff, an old cold storage facility converted into a research node. On paper, it was a private agri-lab. In truth, a staging ground. Jack and his team reached the outer perimeter under cover of a storm. Thunder cracked. Wind howled. Perfect. Cassie disarmed the first motion gate. They're using smart dust, she warned. We're not invisible here. Doesn't matter, Jack said. We're not here to sneak. Inside, the facility was a skeleton. White steel, narrow corridors, the hum of generators and machines that shouldn't exist outside a war zone. The deeper they went, the less it looked like agriculture, and the more it looked like preparation. Stacks of sealed crates marked with old military tags, D.I-019 cages, empty, lined with radiation warning tape. Screens showing maps not just of Briar Gap, but dozens of other rural towns across the country. Travis whispered, they weren't finished with you. Briar Gap was the first test. Myra's voice was ice. So we end the series. They reached the core lab. Red lights pulsed from within. Inside, they found the terminal, plugged directly into a fusion battery, same model as the one under the ridge. Mira stepped forward. Give me 3 minutes. Jack and the others held the corridor, watching both ends. Their breath slow, their hearts steady. Then came the footsteps. 6 guards. Tactical gear. Real soldiers. Not renegades. Cassie raised her rifle. They're coming. Jack didn't blink. Then hold. The firefight was brutal. Bull took a round in the thigh and kept firing. Travis laid cover with surgical precision, never flinching. Cassie went low, close quarters, sharp and ruthless. Jack moved like shadow, controlled, cold, devastating. By the time it ended, 5 were down. 1 fled. Inside the lab, Mira whispered, got it. Uploading everything. Shutting down the grid. Alarms screamed. Systems failed. Lights died. Outside, a backup generator tried to kick on, then failed. Cassie looked at Jack. We done. He nodded. Now we bury it. They set charges throughout the lab. Timed. Controlled. Enough to collapse the foundation but leave the records Mira pulled untouched, already in the hands of journalists, prosecutors, and every watchdog Jack trusted. They hiked out under cover of smoke. 1 hour later, Bell Canyon fell. Not in war. In truth. 6 months later, Jack stood in D.C., outside a hearing chamber. He wasn't there to testify, just to watch. Inside, men in suits squirmed under spotlights. Congressmen read off leaked emails, secret budgets, classified programs suddenly very public. Jack didn't smile. Justice wasn't about headlines. It was about the next Briar Gap that wouldn't burn. Back home, the town was more than rebuilt, it was reborn. Solar panels lined the rooftops. A new school opened near the Ridge. Ridge-Watch chapters expanded into 3 other states. And at the center of it all, a new memorial stood. Steel, weathered, honest, carved into the side. They came to silence us. We answered with thunder, in memory of those who stood and still stand. Final scene, twilight on the ridge. Jack and Mira watch the sun dip below the mountains. The wind carries voices, children playing, hammers ringing, laughter echoing. Mira nudges him. Still waiting for that other shoe? He shakes his head. No. Now I'm the one watching. She smiles. Good. Because this place? It's worth it. He looks out over Briar Gap, standing proud below. I know. Fade to black. This was never just a story about war. It was about resistance. About how ordinary people, when united by loyalty, love, and honor, can stare down monsters in the dark and win.